The bullet shattered the window of Eleanor Hartley's general store at precisely the moment she was telling Mrs. Patterson that no, she would not be attending another one of her insufferable matchmaking socials, and the sharp crack of gunfire sent both women diving behind the counter as splinters of wood and glass rained down upon the bolts of calico and sacks of flour. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she reached beneath the counter for the Winchester rifle she kept loaded and ready. This was Dusty Creek, Wyoming Territory, in the summer of 1882, and a woman who ran her own business had to be prepared for anything. The town had grown rapidly with the arrival of the railroad 3 years prior, bringing prosperity but also trouble in the form of drifters, gamblers, and men who thought a woman alone was easy prey. "Stay down and born," Eleanor commanded Mrs. Patterson, whose face had gone pale as milk. Eleanor crept toward the front window, keeping low, her dark hair coming loose from its practical bun. She was 24 years old, had been running this store since her father's death 2 years ago, and she would be damned if some fool with a gun was going to rob her in broad daylight. Another shot rang out, this one clearly aimed at the saloon across the street. Not a robbery, then, just another fight spilling out onto Main Street. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding and carefully peered over the windowsill. What she saw made her forget about the danger entirely. A tall cowboy with sun-bleached hair had tackled one of the shooters to the dusty ground, wrestling the gun from his hand with an efficiency that spoke of experience. He moved like water, fluid and unstoppable, and even from this distance Eleanor could see the muscles in his shoulders straining against his worn blue shirt as he pinned the man down. Another cowboy, this one older with a gray-streaked beard, had disarmed the second shooter and was hauling him to his feet. Sheriff Morgan came running down the street, his deputy close behind, and within minutes the situation was under control. The two troublemakers were being marched toward the jail, and Eleanor finally allowed herself to stand fully upright, her rifle still in her hands. "Goodness gracious," Mrs. Patterson gasped, fanning herself with her handkerchief. "I thought we were going to die." "We were never in any real danger," Eleanor said. Though her voice was perhaps a bit more sharp than she intended, the adrenaline was still coursing through her veins, making her irritable. "Those fools were too drunk to hit the side of a barn." "Still," Mrs. Patterson said, straightening her bonnet with shaking fingers, "a woman alone shouldn't have to deal with such things. If you had a husband, Eleanor, you could leave these matters to him. You wouldn't have to risk your life defending a store." Eleanor's jaw tightened. This was a familiar refrain, one she heard from nearly every matron in Dusty Creek. At 24, she was considered well past the age when she should have married, and the fact that she showed no interest in changing her situation scandalized the town's more traditional residents. "I don't need a husband to defend my store, Mrs. Patterson," Eleanor said, setting the rifle back under the counter with more force than necessary. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." "But don't you want a family, children, a home of your own?" Mrs. Patterson's voice had taken on that wheedling, pitying tone that made Eleanor want to scream. "I have a home. This store is mine, bought and paid for. And as for children, well, perhaps someday, but I'm in no rush." Eleanor began sweeping up the broken glass, her movements brisk and efficient. "Besides, Mrs. Patterson, they say I'm too independent for marriage. No man in Dusty Creek wants a wife who can outshoot him and balance her own books." Mrs. Patterson opened her mouth to respond, but the bell above the door chimed, and both women turned to see who had entered. Eleanor found herself looking up into the bluest eyes she had ever seen, set in a face that was all hard angles and sun-bronzed skin. It was the cowboy from the street, the one who had tackled the shooter. And up close he was even more striking. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and lean hips, and when he removed his hat, his hair was the color of wheat in late summer. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, nodding to Mrs. Patterson before his gaze settled on Eleanor. "I wanted to apologize for the trouble. Those were some of our crew, and they got into the whiskey earlier than they should have. We're drovers, bringing a herd up from Texas to the railhead here, and I'm afraid some of the boys forgot their manners." His voice was deep and warm, with a slight Texas drawl that softened the edges of his words. Eleanor found herself staring, which was ridiculous. She had seen plenty of cowboys in her time running the store. Dusty Creek was a cattle town, and drovers came through regularly. But there was something about this man that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with the earlier gunfire. "Your men could have killed someone," Eleanor said, forcing herself to sound stern rather than flustered. "This is a respectable town, and we don't appreciate violence on our streets." "No, ma'am, I'm sure you don't," he replied, and there was genuine contrition in his expression. "I've already spoken to the sheriff, and I'll be paying for any damages out of my own pocket, including your window there." He gestured to the shattered glass. Then his eyes dropped to the broom in her hands. "Let me help you with that." Before Eleanor could protest, he had crossed the room and taken the broom from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers for just a moment, calloused and warm, and Eleanor felt a jolt of something electric race up her arm. She stepped back quickly, unsettled by her own reaction. "I can manage," she said, but he was already sweeping, his movements surprisingly graceful for such a large man. "I'm sure you can," he said, glancing up at her with a smile that made her stomach flip. "But my mama raised me to clean up my own messes even when they're caused by men who work for me. I'm James Cordell, by the way. Most folks call me Cord." "Eleanor Hartley," she replied, then immediately wondered why she had given him her first name instead of the more proper Miss Hartley. "This is my store." "Your store?" He paused in his sweeping, looking around the well-organized space with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. "That's impressive. Can't be easy, running a business like this on your own." Eleanor braced herself for the usual platitudes about how she must miss having a man to help her, or how brave she was to attempt such a thing, but they didn't come. Instead, Cord simply returned to sweeping, gathering the glass into a neat pile. "It's not," Eleanor admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. "But it's mine, and I've built it up from nearly nothing after my father died. We're the largest general store between Cheyenne and Sheridan now." "You should be proud of that," Cord said, and there was no condescension in his tone, only respect. "Takes real strength to build something and make it thrive." Mrs. Patterson, who had been watching this exchange with barely concealed interest, suddenly seemed to remember that she had somewhere else to be. "Well, I must be going," she announced, gathering her packages. "Eleanor, do think about what I said, and Mr. Cordell, welcome to Dusty Creek." After she left, an oddly comfortable silence fell over the store. Cord finished sweeping and disposed of the glass in the bin Eleanor indicated, then stood there, hat in hand, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I heard what you said," he told her, his voice quiet, "before I came in, about being too independent for marriage." Eleanor felt heat flood her cheeks. Of course he had heard. The window was broken after all. "I suppose you think that's prideful of me." "No," Cord said, and the smile that spread across his face was slow and genuine. "I think it's honest, and for what it's worth, I like your strength. World's got too many wilting flowers already. It could use more women who know their own minds." Eleanor stared at him, completely taken aback. In 2 years of running this store, of dealing with countless men who thought she needed their guidance or protection, or proposals of marriage that were more about acquiring her business than any real affection, no one had ever said anything like that to her. "That's a rather unusual opinion for a man to hold," she managed to say. "Maybe," Cord acknowledged, "but I've been all over the West, Miss Hartley, and I've seen women do everything men do and do it just as well. Seems foolish to think otherwise." He settled his hat back on his head, adjusting it with a practiced gesture. "Now about that window, I'll send someone over this afternoon to measure it, and I'll have it replaced before I leave town. Is there anything else that needs fixing?" Eleanor looked around her store, at the familiar shelves and counters that represented her independence and her hard work. A few items had been knocked over in the scramble for cover, but nothing else was damaged. "No, just the window, and I appreciate you taking responsibility. Least I can do." Cord moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "How long does it take to get a window shipped out here?" About 2 weeks usually, Eleanor said. I can board it up in the meantime. I'll take care of that too, Cord said. We'll be here for about a week anyway, getting the herd ready for transport and giving the men some rest. If you need anything else, we're camped just east of town, near the creek. After he left, Eleanor stood in the center of her store, feeling oddly off balance. She had dealt with hundreds of customers, had negotiated with suppliers, and stood up to men who tried to cheat her. But 5 minutes with James Cordell had left her more rattled than all of those encounters combined. She told herself it was just because he had been kind, and kindness from men who didn't want something from her was rare. She told herself it was because he had respected her work instead of pitying her situation. She told herself it meant nothing at all. But that night, lying in her small apartment above the store, she found herself thinking about blue eyes and a slow smile, and wondering what it would be like to talk to someone who saw her strength as an asset rather than a flaw. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of hammering. She dressed quickly in a practical cotton dress the color of sage, twisted her long dark hair into a bun, and hurried downstairs to find 2 men boarding up her broken window with neat, precise movements. One of them was the older cowboy from yesterday, the one with the gray-streaked beard. "Morning, miss," he said, tipping his hat. "I'm Dutch Hanson, Cord's segundo. We'll have this boarded up proper in no time, and we've already sent word to Cheyenne about the glass." "Thank you," Eleanor said, watching them work. "That's very efficient." "Cord's a good boss," Dutch said, driving another nail home. "Takes care of his responsibilities and then some. Not many trail bosses would pay for damages out of their own pocket, but Cord's got a strong sense of what's right." Eleanor stored that information away, telling herself she was just being practical. It was good to know which men in town could be trusted and which couldn't. It had nothing to do with the flutter in her chest when she thought about seeing Cord again. The day passed in its usual rhythm of customers and inventory and bookkeeping. Eleanor sold yard goods to Mrs. Chen for new curtains, helped old Mr. Winters find the tobacco he liked, and ordered 3 new rifles from a drummer who was passing through. It was a good day, a profitable day, and she should have been satisfied. But she found her eyes drifting to the door every time the bell chimed, and her heart sinking slightly each time it wasn't Cord who entered. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting through the boards over the window in bars of gold, when he finally appeared. He was cleaner than he had been yesterday, his hair damp as though he had bathed in the creek, and he carried a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Afternoon, Miss Hartley," he said, setting the bundle on the counter. "I brought you something." Eleanor looked at the package with suspicion. She had learned to be wary of gifts from men. They always seemed to come with expectations attached. "That wasn't necessary." "I know," Cord said easily, "but I wanted to. It's not much. Just some coffee. Real coffee from New Orleans, not the chicory blend most folks drink out here. Figured it might help make up for the inconvenience of having your window shot out." Despite herself, Eleanor felt her resistance melting. She loved coffee, had loved it since she was a girl, and her father would let her have a cup on special occasions. But good coffee was expensive, and she usually contented herself with the cheaper blends. "That's very kind," she said, pulling the package toward her. The rich smell of the coffee was already seeping through the paper, making her mouth water. "Thank you. You're welcome." Cord leaned against the counter, completely at ease, as though he had all the time in the world. "Business seems good. You've had a steady stream of customers since I got here." "People need supplies," Eleanor said, then mentally kicked herself for such a prosaic response. "But yes, business is good. Dusty Creek has grown a lot in the past few years, and I've worked hard to make sure I stock what people need." "Smart," Cord said. "I've seen a lot of general stores in my time, and most of them are poorly organized. You can tell when someone really understands their business. You've got everything laid out logical, easy to find, and your prices are fair." Eleanor felt a warm glow of pride at the compliment. "You've been pricing my goods?" "Habit," Cord admitted with a grin. "When you're responsible for feeding and supplying a crew of 30 men, you get to know what things should cost. You're not trying to gouge folks just because you're the only store in town. That's rare." "My father taught me that a fair price keeps customers coming back," Eleanor said. "Greed might make you rich in the short term, but it ruins you in the long run." "Sounds like your father was a wise man." "He was." Eleanor felt the familiar pang of loss that always came when she thought of her father. It had been 2 years, but she still missed him terribly. He had been her champion, the one who had taught her to read and cipher, who had encouraged her curiosity instead of trying to squash it. He believed women were just as capable as men, given the chance. Not many men think that way. My mother ran a boarding house after my father died, Cord said quietly, raised 4 kids on what she made, and never once complained or asked for charity. I learned early that women are plenty strong. He paused, his blue eyes steady on hers. But I imagine you get tired of having to prove that to people. Eleanor was startled by how accurately he had read her. Every single day, she admitted. There are men in this town who still think I'll fail, that I'll have to sell the store and go be someone's housekeeper or marry out of desperation. It would almost be satisfying if it wasn't so exhausting. Then prove them wrong, Cord said simply, and enjoy doing it. They talked for the next hour, an easy conversation that ranged from the challenges of running a business to the differences between Texas and Wyoming, from the changing cattle industry to books they had read. Eleanor learned that Cord had been driving cattle since he was 16, that he had saved enough to buy a small ranch of his own near San Antonio, and that this drive was his last before he went home to settle down and build up his herd. She told him about growing up in Dusty Creek, about learning the store business at her father's knee, about the satisfaction of balancing the books and seeing her profits grow. She told him things she had never told anyone, and he listened with an attention that made her feel truly heard. When he finally left, promising to stop by tomorrow to check on the window situation, Eleanor realized that the sun had set and she had forgotten to eat supper. More significantly, she realized that she had been happy in a way she hadn't been in a very long time. Over the next few days, Cord became a regular presence in the store. He would stop by in the morning to check on the window repairs, or in the afternoon to purchase supplies for his crew, or in the evening just to talk. Each visit was a bright spot in Eleanor's day, and she found herself looking forward to them with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. The townsfolk noticed, of course, Dusty Creek was too small for a trail boss to pay repeated visits to the unmarried female store owner without generating gossip. Mrs. Patterson made pointed comments about appropriate behavior. The banker, Mr. Jessup, who had been pressing his suit for months, grew cold and distant. Even the sheriff mentioned that perhaps Eleanor should be careful about encouraging the attentions of a man who would be leaving town soon. Eleanor ignored them all. For the first time in years, she was enjoying herself, and she wasn't about to let small-minded gossip ruin that. On the 4th day of Cord's stay in Dusty Creek, Eleanor was in the back room doing inventory when she heard raised voices from the front of the store. She hurried out to find Mr. Jessup standing at the counter, his face red with anger, while her clerk, young Tommy Watson, looked on nervously. "I'm telling you, Miss Hartley needs to understand her position in this town," Jessup was saying, his voice sharp. "She may own this store, but she still needs the goodwill of the business community, and consorting with riffraff isn't going to help her." "Riffraff?" Eleanor's voice was cold as she stepped into the room. "Are you referring to Mr. Cordell, Mr. Jessup?" Jessup turned to face her, not even having the grace to look embarrassed. He was a portly man in his 40s, with thinning hair and soft hands that had never done a day of real work. He had been pursuing Eleanor since her father's death, and she suspected it had more to do with acquiring the store than any real affection for her. "I'm referring to a trail boss who won't be in town more than a week," Jessup said. "A man with no prospects, no property, no real future. You're making yourself look foolish, Eleanor, and people are talking." "Let them talk," Eleanor said, her temper rising. "I run a business, Mr. Jessup. That means I welcome all customers who can pay for their goods. Mr. Cordell has been nothing but respectful and has paid promptly for everything he's purchased. I don't see what business it is of yours or anyone else's who I speak to." "I'm thinking of your reputation," Jessup said, but his eyes were calculating. A woman alone is always vulnerable to gossip. If you had a husband, someone established in the community, someone who could guide you in these matters, you wouldn't have to worry about such things. The audacity of it took Eleanor's breath away. "Are you actually using gossip that you helped spread as a reason why I should marry you? I'm offering you protection. You Jessup said stiffly. And a partnership. Combined, our businesses would make us the most prosperous couple in Dusty Creek. I don't need your protection, and I don't want your partnership, Eleanor said flatly. Now, unless you have actual business to conduct, I'll have to ask you to leave. I have work to do. Jessup's face went from red to purple. You'll regret this, Eleanor. A woman who doesn't know her place usually ends up learning it the hard way. He stormed out, and Eleanor stood there, shaking with anger and a little bit of fear. She had made an enemy today, and Mr. Jessup was on the board of the bank that held the mortgage on her store. You all right, Miss Eleanor? Tommy asked, his young face concerned. I'm fine, Tommy, Eleanor said, forcing herself to take a deep breath. Just fine. But she wasn't fine, and that evening when Cord stopped by just as she was closing up, she must have shown it, because his expression immediately shifted from friendly to concerned. What's wrong? He asked, closing the door behind him. Nothing, Eleanor said automatically, then stopped herself. She was tired of pretending everything was always under control. Actually, everything. I had a rather unpleasant encounter today with one of the town's prominent citizens, and I'm worried about the consequences. She told him about Jessup's visit, about the implied threat regarding the bank, about the constant pressure to marry someone suitable and give up her independence. Cord listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she spoke. Sounds like this Jessup is a real piece of work, he said when she finished. But you said the bank holds your mortgage. Do you owe much? Not really, Eleanor said. Another year and it'll be paid off, but until then, they could make things difficult for me if they wanted to. Cord was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Then he said, How much do you owe? Eleanor named a figure, and Cord nodded slowly. I could cover that. What? Eleanor stared at him. No, absolutely not. Why not? Cord's voice was calm, reasonable. I've got the money, saved up from years of driving cattle. It's just sitting in a bank in San Antonio, not doing anyone any good. You'd pay me back on whatever terms we agreed on, and Jessup couldn't hold the threat of the bank over your head. Because I don't take charity, Eleanor said, her pride flaring, and because people would talk even more if they knew I had accepted money from you. It wouldn't be charity, it would be a business loan, Cord said. And as for people talking, they're going to talk no matter what you do. You know that. The question is whether you're going to let their talk control your life. Eleanor wanted to argue, but she couldn't find the words. He was right after all. The gossips of Dusty Creek had been trying to control her life for 2 years now, and she was tired of it. I'd pay you back every penny, she said finally, with interest. Fair enough, Cord said. I'll wire my bank in San Antonio tomorrow and have the funds transferred. You can pay off the mortgage and be free of Jessup's threats. Why are you doing this? Eleanor asked, her voice soft. You barely know me. Cord stepped closer, close enough that she could see the darker ring of blue around his irises, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him. Maybe I want to know you better, he said quietly. And maybe I think a woman who's built something this impressive deserves to hold on to it without having to fight off vultures like Jessup. Eleanor's heart was hammering in her chest. She had never been this close to him before, had never seen the way his eyes darkened when he looked at her, had never felt the pull of attraction so strongly that it was almost a physical thing. You're leaving in a few days, she said, and hated how much like a protest it sounded. I know, Cord said. But a lot can happen in a few days. He left soon after, and Eleanor closed up the store in a daze. Her practical mind told her she was being foolish, that she was setting herself up for heartbreak by caring for a man who would be gone by the end of the week. But her heart, which had been carefully guarded for so long, was already lost. The next 3 days passed in a blur of heightened awareness and increasing intimacy. Cord was true to his word, wiring for the funds and accompanying Eleanor to the bank to pay off her mortgage. The look on Mr. Jessup's face when she handed over the full payment was worth every penny. You'll still need the bank's services, Jessup said stiffly, clearly trying to salvage some authority. Somewhere to keep your profits, someone to extend credit when you need it. I'll be taking my business to the bank in Sheridan, Eleanor said sweetly. I hear they're much more progressive in their attitudes toward female business owners. Outside the bank, Cord laughed, a rich, genuine sound that made Eleanor smile despite her lingering anger. You enjoyed that. Immensely, Eleanor admitted. Is that petty of me? Probably, Cord said, but sometimes petty feels good. They walked back to the store together, and Eleanor was acutely aware of the way people watched them, the way the whispers followed in their wake. She didn't care. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had found someone who understood her, someone who saw her as an equal rather than a problem to be solved or a prize to be won. That evening, Cord asked if she would have dinner with him at the hotel restaurant, and Eleanor found herself saying yes before her practical mind could list all the reasons why it was a bad idea. She wore her best dress, a deep green silk that brought out the color of her eyes and made her dark hair look almost black in the lamplight. She pinned her hair up in a style that was more elaborate than her usual practical bun, and even dabbed on a bit of the rosewater perfume she had been saving for a special occasion. When she came downstairs, Cord was waiting for her, and the look on his face made every moment of preparation worthwhile. He had cleaned up as well, wearing a white shirt that looked new and a black string tie, and his hair was still damp and neatly combed back from his face. You look beautiful, he said, and there was such sincerity in his voice that Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. Thank you, she managed. You look very handsome yourself. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Dusty Creek, with white tablecloths and actual china plates. The food was nothing special, just the usual beef and potatoes and biscuits, but Eleanor barely tasted it. She was too focused on Cord, on the way the lamplight caught in his hair, on the way he listened to her stories with complete attention, on the way his hand brushed against hers when they both reached for the salt. They talked about everything and nothing. He told her about the ranch he was building in Texas, about his plans to raise quality breeding stock rather than just drive cattle to market. She told him about her ideas for expanding the store, maybe opening a second location in one of the smaller towns nearby. You could do it, Cord said when she mentioned the expansion plan. You've got a good head for business, and you're not afraid of hard work. It would mean taking on debt again, Eleanor said, and finding someone I could trust to run the second location. Those are both significant risks. Everything worth doing involves risk, Cord said. The question is whether the potential reward is worth it. Is that your philosophy on life? Eleanor asked, smiling. It's gotten me this far, Cord said. Then, his voice dropping lower, and it brought me to Dusty Creek. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with an awareness that made Eleanor's skin tingle. She knew they were moving towards something, some moment of decision that would change everything, and she was both terrified and exhilarated by the prospect. After dinner, Cord walked her back to the store. The night was clear and cool, the stars brilliant overhead, and the sound of piano music drifted from the saloon down the street. Dusty Creek was settling in for the night, windows glowing with lamplight, the occasional voice or burst of laughter breaking the peaceful quiet. They stopped outside the store, and Eleanor found herself reluctant to go inside to end this perfect evening. Thank you for dinner, she said. I had a wonderful time. So did I, Cord said. He was standing close to her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look up at him, and his eyes were dark in the starlight. Eleanor, I need to tell you something. Her heart stuttered. All right. I'm supposed to leave the day after tomorrow, Cord said. The herd's been sold, the men are paid, and there's no reason for me to stay longer. But I find myself not wanting to go. Oh, Eleanor breathed, because she couldn't seem to form any other words. I know it's fast, Cord continued. I know we've only known each other a week, but I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You're smart and strong and beautiful, and when I'm with you, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Eleanor's eyes were burning with tears she refused to let fall. I feel the same way, she whispered, but you have a ranch waiting for you in Texas. You have a life you've been building toward. I do, Cord agreed. But what's the point of building a life if you don't have someone to share it with? He reached out and cupped her face in his hands. his touch gentle despite the calluses on his palms. "Come with me, Eleanor. Come to Texas and marry me. We'll build the ranch together and you can open a store there if you want, or we can hire someone to manage your store here and keep it running. I know it's asking a lot. I know you've worked hard for what you have here, but I'm asking anyway." Eleanor's mind was reeling. Marriage. Texas. Leaving Dusty Creek. Leaving the store she had fought so hard to keep. It was everything she had said she didn't want, everything she had sworn she would never do. But as she looked up at Cord, at the hope and love shining in his eyes, she realized that what she had been protecting all this time wasn't her independence. It was her heart. She had been so afraid of losing herself the way she had seen other women lose themselves in marriage, becoming nothing more than extensions of their husbands, that she had closed herself off to the possibility of real partnership. Cord wasn't asking her to give up who she was. He was asking her to be who she was with him beside her. "Yes," she said, and watched his face transform with joy. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll come to Texas and we'll build a life together." Cord let out a whoop of happiness that probably woke half the town, then swept her up in his arms and spun her around. When he set her down, he kissed her, a kiss that was both tender and passionate, full of promise and possibility. Eleanor kissed him back, pouring all of her hope and fear and love into that one perfect moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cord rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Eleanor Hartley. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes." "I love you too," Eleanor said, and felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. "And I know I won't regret it. How could I regret choosing to be with someone who sees me for who I really am?" They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, making plans and dreaming dreams. They would marry before they left Dusty Creek, a simple ceremony with the few friends Eleanor had made in town. They would hire a manager for the store, someone Eleanor trusted to run it properly. And then they would head south to Texas, to Cord's ranch, and the life they would build together. The next day, Eleanor was a whirlwind of activity. She met with her lawyer to draw up papers that would allow the store to continue operating in her absence. She met with Tommy Watson's older brother, Marcus, who had experience in business and was eager for the opportunity to manage the store. She sorted through her personal belongings, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. The town's reaction to the news of her engagement was mixed. Mrs. Patterson was scandalized that Eleanor would rush into marriage with a man she had known for barely a week, then marry someone who would take her away from Dusty Creek. The sheriff was cautiously optimistic, having taken the time to ask around about Cord and hearing only good things, and Mr. Jessup was furious, which Eleanor took as confirmation that she was making the right decision. The wedding took place 2 days later in the small church at the edge of town. Eleanor wore a simple cream-colored dress she had ordered from a catalog months ago for a completely different purpose, and Cord wore his best suit, which made him look almost civilized despite his sun-weathered face and calloused hands. Dutch Hansen stood as witness, along with Mrs. Chen, who had always been kind to Eleanor. The ceremony was brief, the words familiar but weighted with significance. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Cord kissed her with such tenderness that Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks. Afterward, there was a small celebration at the hotel paid for by Cord. Most of the town turned out, drawn by curiosity as much as genuine well wishes. But Eleanor didn't care. She was married to the man she loved, and they were starting a new adventure together. That night, in the room Cord had rented at the hotel, Eleanor lay in her husband's arms and felt a contentment she had never known before. They had made love with a passion and tenderness that left her breathless, and now, in the quiet aftermath, she traced idle patterns on his chest and thought about the future. "Are you happy?" Cord asked, his voice a low rumble beneath her ear. "Completely," Eleanor said. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible," Cord said. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I know this is a big change for you, leaving everything familiar behind. If you ever regret it, If you ever want to come back here, just tell me. We'll figure it out. Eleanor propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. I won't regret it, she said firmly. Yes, I'm leaving Dusty Creek, but I'm not leaving myself behind. I'm bringing all of who I am with me. And I think that's what makes this different from what I always feared marriage would be. You're not asking me to become someone else. You're asking me to be myself with you. Cord smiled up at her, his blue eyes soft with love. That's all I ever want. Just you, exactly as you are. They left Dusty Creek 3 days later, after ensuring that Marcus Watson was settled in as the store's manager and that all the legal paperwork was in order. Eleanor stood in the store one last time, looking around at the shelves she had stocked and the floor she had swept and the counter where she had spent countless hours serving customers and balancing books. She felt a pang of sadness, but it was tempered by excitement for what lay ahead. This store had been her security, her proof that she could stand on her own. But she didn't need it for that anymore. She knew her own worth, knew her own strength, and she was ready to build something new. The journey to Texas took 3 weeks. They traveled with a small wagon carrying Eleanor's belongings and supplies, taking their time and stopping at interesting towns along the way. Cord showed Eleanor parts of the West she had only heard about, from the red rocks of Colorado to the wide plains of northern Texas. Each night they made camp and talked until the stars came out, sharing stories and dreams and making plans for the ranch. Eleanor learned that Cord had grown up hard, working from the time he was old enough to sit a horse, that he had lost his father young and watched his mother struggle to keep the family together. She understood then why he respected her independence so much. He had seen firsthand what women were capable of when necessity demanded it. She told him about her own childhood, about being the only girl in school who preferred arithmetic to embroidery, about the way her father had encouraged her curiosity even when the town's matrons clucked their tongues. She told him about the loneliness of the past 2 years, of being respected but never truly seen, of wondering if she would ever find someone who could accept all of who she was. You were waiting for me, Cord said, pulling her close, and I was working my way toward you. It just took us a while to get to the right place at the right time. When they finally arrived at Cord's ranch in late September, Eleanor fell in love with it immediately. It was a modest spread, about 500 acres of rolling grassland with a small creek running through it. The house was simple, just 3 rooms, but it was solidly built and had windows that let in the golden Texas light. It's not much yet, Cord said, looking around with a critical eye, but it's got good bones, and the land is fertile. We can build it up into something really special. We will, Eleanor said, squeezing his hand. Together. The first few months were harder than Eleanor had anticipated. She was used to the structure of running a store, to the familiar routine of customers and inventory. Ranch life was different, more unpredictable. There were cattle to tend and fences to mend and 1,000 small tasks that needed doing. The nearest town was 10 miles away, and while it had a general store, it was nothing like what Eleanor was used to. She felt out of place at first, unsure of her role. Cord had hired 2 ranch hands, young men named Pete and Sam, and they clearly knew far more about cattle than she did. She tried to help with the ranch work, but she was clumsy and slow, and she could see the frustration in her own eyes when she looked in the mirror at night. I feel useless, she confessed to Cord one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. You hired me because I'm strong and capable, but I don't know the first thing about ranching. Cord took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. You're learning, Elena, he said, and you'll get better. But Eleanor, you don't have to be a rancher if that's not what you want. You're my wife, my partner. That means we figure out together what works for both of us. What do you mean? Eleanor asked. I mean that maybe your strength isn't in working cattle, Cord said. Maybe it's in managing the business side of the ranch. We need someone to keep the books, to handle the buying and selling, to make sure we're operating efficiently. That's work that needs doing just as much as riding fence. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. I could do that, she said slowly. I'm good with numbers and negotiating. You're great with numbers and negotiating, Cord corrected. And if you want, we could start thinking about opening a store in the nearest town. It doesn't have much. and I bet there's opportunity for someone who knows what they're doing. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor threw herself into understanding the business side of the ranch. She went through Cord's rather haphazard record-keeping with a critical eye, organizing and systematizing until she had a clear picture of their finances. She rode into town and talked to the other ranchers, learning about market prices and buyers and the best times to sell. She also started looking at the general store in town with a professional eye. It was poorly organized and overpriced, and she could see a dozen ways to improve it. When she learned that the owner was looking to sell, she brought the idea to Cord. "We could buy it," she said, spreading her notes out on the kitchen table. "It would cost most of our savings, but I think it would pay for itself within a year. The town is growing, and there's demand for a better store." Cord studied her figures, then looked up at her with pride in his eyes. "Let's do it," he said, "but on one condition." "What's that?" "That we do it as full partners. You run the store because you're better at it than I'll ever be, but any major decisions, we make them together." Eleanor smiled. "I wouldn't have it any other way." They bought the store in November, and Eleanor immediately set about transforming it. She reorganized the shelves, brought in new stock, and established relationships with suppliers she had worked with in Wyoming. Within a month, business had doubled. Within 3 months, they had paid off the loan they had taken to buy the place. Eleanor hired a woman named Maria to help run the store during the days when she needed to be at the ranch, and the two of them developed an easy partnership. Maria was a widow with 3 young children, and the steady work allowed her to support her family. Eleanor taught her bookkeeping and inventory management, and Maria taught Eleanor Spanish and the best ways to cook on a wood stove. Life settled into a rhythm. Eleanor would spend 3 days a week at the store, managing the business and serving customers, and the rest of the time at the ranch, handling the financial side of the cattle operation. Cord worked the ranch with Pete and Sam, buying new breeding stock and slowly building up the herd. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, Eleanor's head on Cord's shoulder, and talk about their day. Sometimes they would disagree about decisions, their different perspectives leading to lively debates. But they always listened to each other, always respected each other's opinions, and they always found a way to compromise. The town took to calling them the partnership couple, because everyone knew that they ran everything together. It was unusual, especially in a time and place where most women's work was invisible, but Cord never let anyone suggest that Eleanor's contributions were less important than his. Winter came, cold and harsh, and Eleanor spent more time at the ranch, snowbound and content. She and Cord would huddle close to the fire, reading or planning for the spring, and Eleanor thought that she had never been happier. In February, she realized she was pregnant. She told Cord one snowy evening, nervous despite herself. They had never really discussed children, and she wasn't sure how he would react. "Really?" Cord's face lit up with such joy that Eleanor's nervousness evaporated. "We're going to have a baby?" "Yes," Eleanor said, laughing as he swept her up in a careful embrace. "In late summer, the doctor thinks." "A baby," Cord kept saying like he couldn't quite believe it. "Our baby." Eleanor gave birth to a healthy baby boy in August of 1883, on a hot Texas afternoon with Maria and the doctor in attendance. They named him Samuel James Cordell, after Cord's father and Cord himself, and from the moment Eleanor held him, she was completely in love. Cord was a devoted father, taking to the role with the same competence he brought to everything else. He would walk the floor with Samuel when he cried at night, giving Eleanor a chance to rest. He built a cradle with his own hands, sanding it until it was smooth and safe, and he looked at his son with such fierce love that it made Eleanor's heart ache. "Thank you," he told her one night, as they stood over Samuel's cradle watching him sleep, "for saying yes, for coming to Texas, for building this life with me. I never knew I could be this happy." "Neither did I," Eleanor said, leaning into her husband's embrace. "I spent so long thinking happiness meant being independent, being alone. But real happiness is being with someone who lets you be strong and vulnerable at the same time." The years passed in a blur of work and joy and growth. The ranch prospered, growing to over 1,000 acres as they bought out neighboring properties. The store became the most successful in the region, and Eleanor eventually opened a second location in a larger town 15 miles away. Samuel grew into a bright, curious boy who loved both the ranch and the stores, and in 1885, Eleanor gave birth to twins, a girl and a boy they named Grace and Thomas. Managing 3 children, 2 stores, and the business side of the ranch should have been overwhelming, but Eleanor thrived. Cord had been right when he said she was strong. She was strong enough to run businesses and raise children and still find time to sit on the porch with her husband and watch the sunset. Life wasn't always easy. There were droughts that hurt the ranch and economic panics that impacted the stores. There were sleepless nights with sick children and tense discussions about money and strategy. But through it all, Eleanor and Cord faced everything together, their partnership only growing stronger with each challenge. In 1890, when Samuel was 7 and the twins were 5, Eleanor received a letter from Marcus Watson in Dusty Creek. He had run the store well for 8 years, but he was ready to retire and wanted to know if Eleanor wanted to sell the business or find a new manager. Eleanor and Cord discussed it at length. The Dusty Creek store was still profitable, but it was hard to manage from so far away. On the other hand, it represented Eleanor's first success, the proof that she could build something from nothing. "What do you want to do?" Cord asked, leaving the decision in her hands. "I want to sell it," Eleanor said finally. "That store was about proving I could stand alone. But I don't need to prove that anymore. I'd rather focus on what we're building here." They sold the Dusty Creek store to Marcus Watson's son for a fair price, and Eleanor used the money to open a third store, this one in a booming railroad town 50 miles away. She hired a young woman named Sarah to manage it, a woman who reminded Eleanor of herself at that age, hungry for opportunity and determined to succeed. In 1892, Eleanor and Cord celebrated their 10th anniversary with a trip to San Antonio, leaving the children with Maria for a week. It was the first time they had been alone together in years, and it felt like a second honeymoon. They stayed in a fancy hotel, ate at expensive restaurants, and spent hours just talking, reconnecting as the couple they had been before children and businesses filled their lives. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked one night as they walked along the river. "Marrying me so quickly, tying your life to mine?" Cord stopped walking and turned to face her, his blue eyes serious. "Not for a single second," he said. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Eleanor. You made me better, made my life fuller. How could I ever regret that?" "I don't regret it either," Eleanor said softly. "You saw me when I was so busy defending myself that I couldn't see anything else. You saw my strength, but you also saw my loneliness, and you gave me a life where I could be strong and loved at the same time." They renewed their vows in a small chapel in San Antonio, just the two of them and a priest, reaffirming the promises they had made 10 years ago in Dusty Creek. When they returned home, the children mobbed them with hugs and questions, and Eleanor thought that this was what happiness looked like. Not perfect, not always easy, but real and full and worth everything. And the years continued to pass. Samuel grew into a young man who loved the ranch and showed a natural talent for breeding cattle. Grace developed a head for business that rivaled Eleanor's, and by the time she was 15, she was helping manage the books for both the ranch and the stores. Thomas was the dreamer, always reading, always asking questions about the world beyond Texas. In 1898, when war broke out with Spain, Eleanor and Cord held their breath, terrified that Samuel would want to enlist. He was 21, old enough to make his own decisions, and the recruiting posters were everywhere, but Samuel had no interest in the war. He wanted to stay on the ranch, to continue the work his father had started. "This land is my fight," he told them, "making it thrive, building something that will last. That's what matters to me." Eleanor hugged her son tightly, grateful that he had inherited his father's practicality along with his strength. As the new century approached, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed. She was 42 years old, a successful businesswoman, a mother of 3 thriving children, and the wife of a man she loved more with each passing year. The girl who had stood in a general store in Dusty Creek, declaring herself too independent for marriage, seemed like a distant memory. But Eleanor realized that she hadn't given up her independence by marrying Cord. She had expanded it, redefined it, made it into something richer and more complex. True independence, she had learned, wasn't about standing alone. It was about having the strength to choose your own path, even when that path led you to partnership rather than solitude. On New Year's Eve, 1899, Eleanor and Cord stood on their porch, watching fireworks light up the sky over the distant town. The children were inside, laughing and celebrating, and the sounds of their joy drifted out into the night. "We did it," Cord said, pulling Eleanor close. "We built a good life." "We did," Eleanor agreed, resting her head against his shoulder, "and I wouldn't change a single thing." The new century brought new challenges and new opportunities. The ranch continued to grow, and they began breeding horses alongside cattle. The stores expanded into mail order, taking advantage of improved rail service to reach customers across Texas and beyond. Grace took over day-to-day management of the retail business, showing an aptitude that impressed even Eleanor. Samuel became Cord's full partner in running the ranch, and Thomas went off to university, the first Cordell to receive a formal education. In 1905, Samuel married a smart, strong-willed young woman named Catherine, and Eleanor saw in their partnership echoes of her own marriage. Catherine wasn't content to just be a rancher's wife. She started a dairy operation on the ranch, selling butter and cheese to the stores and other local businesses. Eleanor and Cord welcomed her as a true daughter, delighted to see the next generation continuing the tradition of partnership they had established. Grace shocked everyone in 1907 by announcing that she was opening a store in Dallas, the biggest city in Texas. She was 22, unmarried, and determined to prove herself in a larger market. Eleanor understood completely. "You remind me of myself at your age," Eleanor told her daughter. "Driven, focused, unwilling to let anyone tell you what you can't do." "I learned from the best," Grace said, hugging her mother. "You showed me that a woman can do anything if she's willing to work for it." Thomas returned from university in 1909 with a law degree and immediately began working to improve conditions for working people. He shocked the family by moving to Austin and joining the progressive movement, but Eleanor was proud of his commitment to justice. In 1912, Eleanor and Cord celebrated their 30th anniversary. They were both in their 50s now, their hair streaked with gray, their faces lined with the evidence of decades of hard work and laughter. But when Cord looked at Eleanor, she still saw the same love that had been in his eyes that day in Dusty Creek when he had told her he liked her strength. 30 years, Eleanor marveled. It feels like a lifetime and like no time at all. "Best 30 years of my life," Cord said, kissing her softly. "And I'm looking forward to 30 more." They threw a big party, inviting everyone from the surrounding ranches and towns. Samuel and Catherine came with their 2 children, Eleanor's first grandchildren. Grace traveled from Dallas, taking time away from her thriving business. Thomas came from Austin, full of stories about political battles and social reform. As Eleanor looked around at her family, at the life she and Cord had built together, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had taken a chance 30 years ago, had said yes to a cowboy she barely knew, and it had led her to this moment. After the party, when all the guests had gone home and the children had retreated to their rooms, Eleanor and Cord sat on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. The Texas stars were brilliant overhead, and the air was soft with the promise of summer. "Do you remember that night in Dusty Creek?" Eleanor asked, "when you asked me to marry you?" "Every detail," Cord said. "You were wearing that green dress, and you looked so beautiful I could barely breathe. And when you said yes, I felt like the luckiest man alive." "I was so scared," Eleanor admitted. "I had spent so long protecting my independence, and suddenly I was agreeing to give it all up for a man I had known a week." "But you didn't give it up," Cord said. "You shared it. And in sharing it, you made both our lives bigger." "I know that now," Eleanor said, "but I didn't know it then. I took a leap of faith and you caught me." "We caught each other," Cord corrected. "That's what marriage is, Eleanor. It's 2 people choosing to catch each other over and over for the rest of their lives. In 1915, the ranch celebrated its 30th anniversary of operation. It was now one of the largest and most respected cattle operations in Central Texas, known for the quality of its breeding stock and the fairness of its business practices. The retail business had grown to 7 stores across the state, all operating under the Cordell name, all managed with the same principles of fairness and quality that Eleanor had established in Dusty Creek. Eleanor was 60 years old, and while she had stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the businesses, she was still actively involved in strategic planning. She and Grace would spend hours discussing expansion opportunities and market trends, and Eleanor took great pride in her daughter's success. Cord was 62, and while he still rode out with Samuel to check the cattle, he left most of the physical work to younger men. He spent his time breeding new lines of cattle and horses, using knowledge he had accumulated over 4 decades of ranching. They were grandparents 5 times over now, and their house was often full of the chaos and joy of visiting grandchildren. Eleanor loved being a grandmother, loved the way the children would climb into her lap and beg for stories about the old days. "Tell us about when you met Grandpa," the eldest granddaughter, Anna, would say. "Tell us about Dusty Creek." And Eleanor would tell them about a young woman who thought she was too independent for marriage, and a cowboy who saw her strength as something to celebrate rather than something to overcome. She would tell them about taking chances and building lives and the power of true partnership. In 1918, the world was at war, and the ranch contributed to the war effort by increasing production and selling cattle to feed the troops. Thomas worked in Washington helping to draft legislation to support veterans. Samuel and Grace both bought war bonds and organized local efforts to support the soldiers overseas. Eleanor and Cord worried constantly, grateful that their son was too old to be drafted, praying that the war would end soon. When it finally did, in November of that year, they celebrated with the rest of the nation, relieved that the killing had stopped. The 1920s brought prosperity and change. The ranch modernized, bringing in trucks and tractors to replace some of the horse-drawn equipment. The stores began to face competition from national chains, but the Cordell reputation for quality and fair dealing kept customers loyal. Grace opened the first Cordell department store in Dallas, a 3-story building that sold everything from clothing to furniture. In 1922, Eleanor and Cord celebrated their 40th anniversary. Eleanor was 64, Cord was 66, and they had been together longer than they had been apart. Their hair was white now, and they moved a bit slower than they once had, but the love between them was as strong as ever. 40 years, Cord said, shaking his head in wonder. "When I met you, I never imagined I could be this blessed." "Neither did I," Eleanor said. "I thought happiness meant being alone, being independent. I was so wrong." "You weren't wrong," Cord said gently. "You just had an incomplete definition. Real independence isn't about being alone. It's about having the freedom to choose your own path. And you chose to walk that path with me." "Best choice I ever made," Eleanor said, kissing him softly. They took another trip to San Antonio, recreating their 10th anniversary journey. The city had changed dramatically in the 30 years since their last visit, with automobiles crowding the streets and electric lights everywhere. But some things remained the same. They walked along the river, ate at fancy restaurants, and spent hours just talking and being together. "If you could go back," Cord asked one evening, "and give advice to that young woman in Dusty Creek, what would you tell her?" Eleanor thought about it for a long moment. "I'd tell her to trust her heart as much as her head," she said finally. "I'd tell her that strength doesn't mean never needing anyone. It means having the courage to be vulnerable with the right person. And I'd tell her that the cowboy who likes her strength is going to make her happier than she ever dreamed possible." "What would you tell the cowboy?" Cord asked, smiling. "I'd tell him to hold on tight," Eleanor said, laughing, "because life with that independent woman is going to be one hell of an adventure." In 1925, Eleanor officially retired from active involvement in the business, though she still served as an advisor to Grace. At 67, she wanted to spend more time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and to simply enjoy the life she and Cord had built. Cord had mostly retired as well, though he still loved to ride out and check the cattle. He and Eleanor spent their days in peaceful companionship, reading or working in the garden or sitting on the porch and watching the world go by. Samuel ran the ranch with Catherine, and they had expanded into oil exploration, adding new revenue streams. Grace's department store in Dallas had been so successful that she had opened 2 more, one in Houston and one in Fort Worth. Thomas had become a respected lawyer and was considering a run for political office. "We raised good children," Eleanor said one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. "We did," Cord agreed. "They're all strong and independent and kind, just like their mother." "And hardworking and honest and loyal," Eleanor added, "just like their father." In 1928, Eleanor fell ill with pneumonia. It was touch and go for a while, and Cord barely left her bedside, holding her hand and willing her to fight. The doctors were pessimistic given her age, but Eleanor was tough. She had survived everything life had thrown at her, and she wasn't ready to go yet. She recovered slowly, and by spring she was back to her old self, albeit a bit more fragile. The illness had scared both of them, forcing them to confront their mortality. They began talking more seriously about their legacy, about what they wanted to leave behind. "The ranch will go to Samuel," Cord said. "That's always been the plan. And the stores to Grace. But I want to make sure Thomas is taken care of too." They worked with lawyers to draw up detailed wills, ensuring that all their children would be provided for and that the businesses they had built would continue to operate according to the principles they had established. They also set up a charitable fund to support education for young women, remembering how rare opportunities had been when Eleanor was young. The stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent depression hit hard, but the Cordell businesses weathered the storm better than most. The stores had always operated on principles of fair pricing and community service, which built loyalty that lasted through hard times. The ranch was diversified enough that the collapse in cattle prices didn't destroy them, and the family's reputation for honesty and fairness meant that they could still get credit when others couldn't. Samuel and Grace both worked to help their communities through the Depression, extending credit to families in need and hiring as many workers as they could possibly afford. It was a difficult time, but the Cordell name came through it with an enhanced reputation for integrity. In 1932, Eleanor and Cord celebrated their 50th anniversary. It was a bittersweet celebration, as they were both in their 70s now and acutely aware that their time together was growing shorter. But the love between them was as strong as ever, perhaps stronger for having weathered 50 years of joys and sorrows together. The whole family gathered at the ranch for the celebration. Samuel and Catherine, now in their 50s with children and grandchildren of their own. Grace, who had never married but had built a business empire that employed hundreds of people. Thomas, who had served in the state legislature and was now a judge. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren filled the house with noise and laughter. 50 years ago, Cord said in his toast, I met a woman who changed my life. She was strong and independent and beautiful, and she taught me that real love means being partners, not master and servant. Everything good in my life came from the day Eleanor Hartley said yes to a dusty cowboy from Texas. Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes as everyone applauded. When it was her turn to speak, she said, I spent the first 24 years of my life thinking I knew what I wanted. I wanted independence, security, control over my own destiny. And then I met Cord, and he showed me that you can have all those things and still have love. He showed me that the right partner makes you stronger, not weaker. These 50 years have been the greatest gift of my life. As the party continued around them, Eleanor and Cord slipped away to their favorite spot on the porch. The Texas sunset was spectacular, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and they sat hand in hand watching the day fade into night. 50 years, Eleanor said softly. It doesn't seem possible. Best 50 years of my life, Cord said, echoing words he had said many times before. And if I had 50 more years, I'd spend every one of them with you. I love you, Eleanor said, turning to look at her husband. His face was deeply lined now, his hair completely white. But his blue eyes were still as clear and loving as they had been that day in Dusty Creek. I have loved you from almost the moment we met, and I will love you until I take my last breath." "And I love you," Cord said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Eleanor Cordell. You made my life an adventure and a joy." They sat there as the stars came out, holding hands and remembering 50 years of love and laughter and partnership. They talked about the early days when everything was uncertain and they were building their life from nothing. They talked about their children and grandchildren, about the businesses and the ranch, about everything they had accomplished together. "No regrets?" Cord asked, as he had asked so many times over the years. "Not a single one," Eleanor said firmly, "except maybe that we don't have another 50 years ahead of us." "We have whatever time we're given," Cord said, "and we'll make the most of every day." They kept that promise over the next few years. Despite their advancing age and declining health, they remained actively engaged in life, spending time with family, taking short trips, and simply enjoying each other's company. Eleanor continued to read voraciously and kept up with the family businesses, offering advice when asked. Cord still rode out to check the cattle when he felt up to it, unwilling to give up the work that had defined so much of his life. In 1935, Cord's health began to fail. He was 79 years old, and the years of hard physical labor had taken their toll. He developed a persistent cough that the doctors couldn't seem to cure, and he grew weaker as the months passed. Eleanor nursed him with fierce dedication, refusing to accept that she might lose him. She read to him, talked to him about the old days, and held his hand through the long nights when the cough kept him awake. "I'm not ready to let you go," she told him one night, tears streaming down her face. "I know," Cord said, his voice weak but tender, "and I'm not ready to go. But Eleanor, we both know this isn't something we can control." "You're a fighter," Eleanor said stubbornly. "You've always been a fighter. Fight this too." "I am fighting," Cord assured her. "For you, I'll fight as long as I can." He rallied for a time, and there were weeks when Eleanor allowed herself to hope that he might recover. But in his heart, Cord knew the truth. One evening in late October, with the whole family gathered at the ranch, he asked to speak to Eleanor alone. They sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill, and Cord took his wife's hand. "Eleanor, my love, we need to talk about what comes next." "Don't," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "Please don't." "I have to," Cord said gently, "because I need you to know some things before I go." Eleanor bit back her protests and forced herself to listen. "You gave me the best life a man could ask for," Cord said. "Every day with you has been a gift. You were my partner in everything, my equal in all things, and loving you has been the greatest joy of my life." He paused, coughing, and Eleanor held him until it passed. "When I'm gone, I need you to keep living. Don't just survive, Eleanor. Live. Spend time with the grandchildren. Read your books. Meddle in the businesses if you want. Promise me you won't just fade away." "I promise," Eleanor whispered, though the thought of a life without Cord seemed impossible to bear. "And remember that what we had was special," Cord continued. "We built something together that will last long after we're both gone. The ranch, the stores, the family we raised, all of it is a testament to our partnership, to what two people can accomplish when they truly love and respect each other." "I'll remember," Eleanor said, tears flowing freely now. "How could I ever forget?" James Cordell died peacefully in his sleep 3 days later, with Eleanor holding his hand. He was 79 years old, and he had been married to the love of his life for 53 years. Eleanor was devastated. For the first time since she had met Cord, she felt truly alone. The house seemed empty without his presence, and she wandered through the rooms like a ghost, unable to settle anywhere. The family rallied around her, but Eleanor pushed them away. She needed to grieve in her own way, in her own time. She spent hours on the porch where she and Cord had shared so many conversations, trying to feel close to him. Slowly, very slowly, the sharp edge of grief dulled to a constant ache. Eleanor began to emerge from her isolation, to to engage with her family again. Samuel was running the ranch beautifully. Grace's business empire continued to thrive, and Thomas had been appointed to a federal judgeship. They had all turned out well, these children she and Cord had raised, and she found comfort in that. Eleanor lived for another 7 years after Cord's death. She spent that time surrounded by family, telling stories about the early days to anyone who would listen. She wanted to make sure that the younger generations understood what she and Cord had built, the values they had instilled in the family businesses, the importance of partnership and mutual respect. She also wrote a memoir, at Thomas's urging, documenting her life from that first day in Dusty Creek when a cowboy had walked into her store and changed everything. She wrote about building a business as a woman in a man's world, about taking a chance on love, about the 53 years of partnership that had defined her life. The book was published in 1941, just months before Eleanor died. It became something of a sensation, particularly among young women who saw in Eleanor's story a template for their own lives. Here was proof that a woman could be strong and independent and still find love, that marriage didn't have to mean the end of dreams but could be the beginning of even bigger ones. Eleanor Cordell died on a warm spring evening in May of 1942, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She was 84 years old, and she had lived a full, rich, remarkable life. Her last words were of Cord, and there was a smile on her face when she took her final breath. She was buried next to her husband on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. The headstone read simply, Eleanor Hartley Cordell, 1858 to 1942. She was strong, and she was loved. The family businesses continued to thrive for generations. The Cordell Ranch became one of the most respected cattle operations in Texas, known for quality breeding stock and ethical practices. Grace's department stores grew into a regional chain that operated well into the 21st century, and the charitable fund Eleanor and Cord had established helped hundreds of young women get educations and start businesses of their own. But more than the businesses or the wealth, what endured was the story of an independent woman who thought she was too strong for marriage, and the cowboy who saw her strength as the very reason to love her. It was a story about partnership and respect, about two people who chose each other and built a life together that was greater than the sum of its parts. In Dusty Creek, Wyoming, the old general store still stood, though it had changed hands many times since Eleanor sold it. But the locals still told stories about the woman who had run it, the woman who had been brave enough to take a chance on love and smart enough to choose a man who wanted a partner, not a possession. In Central Texas, visitors to the Cordell Ranch could still see the original house, preserved now as a museum. They could walk through the rooms where Eleanor and Cord had raised their children, could stand on the porch where they had spent so many evenings watching the sunset and making plans. And scattered throughout Texas, in the stores and businesses that still bore the Cordell name, employees were taught about the founding principles: fairness, quality, integrity, and respect. They learned about Eleanor and Cord, about how two people with nothing but determination and love had built an empire that lasted. The story of Eleanor and Cord Cordell became a legend, passed down through generations. It was a love story, yes, but it was also a story about strength and independence, about taking chances and building dreams, about the power of true partnership. And at its heart was a simple truth, that the right person doesn't diminish your strength. They celebrate it, support it, and help you become even stronger. That was what Cord had given Eleanor and what Eleanor had given Cord. And in the end, that was what made their story one worth telling and retelling. A testament to what love could be when it was built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine partnership. They had started as strangers in a small Wyoming town, brought together by chance and a broken window. But they had become partners in every sense of the word, building businesses and raising a family and creating a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. It was a remarkable story, made all the more remarkable by the fact that it was true. And it all began with a simple exchange, a woman declaring her independence and a cowboy smiling and saying, "I like your strength." Those 5 words had changed 2 lives and created a love story for the ages. They had proven that strength and love were not opposites but complements, that the strongest people were often those who had the courage to be vulnerable with the right person. And so the story lived on, inspiring new generations to believe in the power of true partnership, to never settle for less than someone who saw their strength as something to celebrate rather than something to overcome. It was a story of the Wild West, of cattle drives and general stores in a time when the country was still young and anything seemed possible. But more than that, it was a story about two people who found each other against all odds, who chose each other every day for 53 years, and who built something beautiful and lasting out of love and respect and an unwavering commitment to partnership. And that, in the end, was the legacy of Eleanor and James Cordell, not just the businesses and the wealth, but the example they set for how two strong people could come together and create something even stronger. It was a legacy worth preserving, a story worth telling, and a love worth celebrating. From that day in 1882 when a trail boss walked into a general store in Dusty Creek, Wyoming, to the day in 1942 when Eleanor took her last breath surrounded by the family she had built, it was a story of courage and chance, of independence and interdependence, of strength celebrated rather than suppressed. It was quite simply one of the great love stories of the American West. And it all started with those 5 perfect words: I like your strength,